Dear colleagues, we now come to the address of the President of Ukraine, His Excellency Mr. Petro Porosenko. I am also very pleased to welcome on this occasion Mr. Pavlo Klimkin, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, as well as Ms. Lilia Hermevich, Minister of Education and Science. Dear President, it is a great honor to welcome you to our Assembly chamber, which you know well, having been yourself a member from 2001 to 2005, and also from your previous visit to Strasbourg in June, 2014. At the time of your visit in 2014, Ukraine found itself in a profound crisis, with a huge strain on the Ukrainian people and the stability of the European continent. We hoped that the next time you came, we could celebrate the end of this crisis, but unfortunately, this does not seem to be the case. You came to us at that time with a very strong message that it is only through peaceful dialogue that the conflict in Ukraine can be resolved. We welcomed your approach and made it clear that the Assembly would keep Ukraine high on its agenda. As you know, we have firmly supported and continue to support Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and have addressed in various resolutions some of the most urgent political and humanitarian consequences of the conflict. At the same time, we have also insisted on the need to advance the internal reform agenda. In the face of the challenges Ukraine faces, it now needs more than ever to be strong with stable institutions and democratic structures. I therefore commend you on the ambitious reform agenda you have put in place and the progress achieved. I encourage you to continue on this positive path and, where possible, to devote even greater energy to carrying out other urgent reforms. Here, I refer in particular to decentralization. Even if the status of parts of Ukraine not under the government's control cannot be resolved at the moment, as well as the fight against corruption. There will also certainly be recommendations coming from the Assembly tomorrow following the urgent debate on the new Ukrainian law on education. As always, the Assembly stands ready to provide Ukraine with the support it needs. Dear President, we now look forward to hearing your message to us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear Secretary General of the Council of Europe, dear President of the Parliamentary Assembly, dear my colleagues, members of the Assembly, ladies and gentlemen, above all, allow me to congratulate sincerely Madam Stella Kyriakidis with her election at a high position of President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And I'm glad that this event has practically coincided with my visit to the Assembly. Such a symbolic junctures do not happen that frequently. Yet, when they happen, they are always accurate and timely. Today is exactly the case. It is because I could personally wish you inspiration, energy, and success in achieving noble mission set by the Parliamentary Assembly Council of Europe, as well as in protecting principles upon which this Assembly is founded. There is no place for the compromise in these matters, especially with those who by all means intend to compromise the universal value and foundations upon which we build up our cooperation and our societies. I would also like to express words of my gratitude for the invitation to address this distinguished Assembly. It is a true honor for me, as former colleague in the Assembly, which spent here many years, remember this time and remember the importance of the Parliamentary Assembly, I perfectly understand the responsibility that lies upon your shoulders, my dear colleagues, especially under current circumstances of extreme populism, numerous cyber attacks, direct armed aggression, and very aggressive propaganda campaign. As a President of Ukraine, I sincerely count on your support of my country in these dramatically difficult circumstances. Now, when we find out ourselves Ukrainians against our will. 3 years ago, I was standing here before this assembly and already as a head of states shared with you our experience from the very first day of countering Russian aggression. And I would sincerely wish to address you today with the words that the aggression against my country is over. That within internationally recognized borders of Ukraine, the military action and the blatant occupation of parts of our sovereign territory are over. That in Ukraine, the peaceful life gradually returned to the liberated lands depleted by the military action of those who keep saying, "Nas tam нет," we are not there, and by the occupation power. Unfortunately, even after 3 years since my statement before the Assembly, we have still not reached this perspective. We are well aware of the reason why. Dear members of the Assembly, has something changed over these 3 years? In Russian deeds and behavior, absolutely nothing. Today, as 3 years ago, we are forced to keep searching for the response for the Russian aggression. The aggression which turned into the brutal attack not only against Ukraine, but also against human rights in the very heart of Europe. Russia keeps bluntly violating commitments taken upon itself. The same way Moscow keeps ignoring our persistent demand and demands of the international community to get back to respect international law. This Assembly has also echoed these demands and fixed them in a number of its resolutions. But Russia keeps pretending that it has nothing to do with that. Moscow continues to turn the blind eye to its commitment under the Minsk Agreement. Its military forces are still on the territory of Ukraine, both in Crimea and in Donbass. Military assets are still delivered to illegal entities created by Russia. And every day we receive more worrying news about the blatant violation of human rights on the occupied territories. Release of the hostages and political prisoners is stalled. And I cannot but mention Oleg Sentsov, Alexander Kolchenko, Roman Sushchenko, and many, many others. For over 2 years, we have fought for freeing 63-year-old Igor Kozlovsky, the very famous theologian who remained in the occupied Donetsk to look after his ill son. And the same goes about 28-year-old Stanislav Aseyev, a journalist who was not afraid to write the truth about the life in the occupied Donetsk. Bad is that such stories of Ukrainian hostages are well over 100 already. But even worse, it is that number of hostages in Donbass does not cease to rise. People are deliberately chased and captured only for the fact that they are citizens of their own country, of the Ukrainian state. And they are captured with the cynical reason in mind to blackmail Ukraine, which will never abandon its citizens, neither in Crimea, nor in Donbass, nor in the Russian prison. Systemic repression have turned the Crimean Peninsula in an island of no freedom and land of fear. In the occupied Crimea, Russia applies the worst practice of the Soviet repressive machine. Anyone who dares to reject the so-called reunification with Russia becomes a victim of the arbitrary detention, prosecution, torturing, extrajudicial execution, and unhuman treatment. Recently, a deputy head of Majlis, Ahtem Cheygos, received the so-called verdict of the occupation authorities. It was him who said that today Crimea, those are tried who defended the laws of their country, international norms and rules. Could anyone give more precise words describing the situation in Crimea than Ahtem Cheygos in his final statement in so-called court? And this concerned not only Crimea, but Europe as a continent of the rule of law, not rule of force. A case of another deputy head of Majlis, Ilmi Umerov, is also telling. At first, this hero of his people experienced the Russian punitive psychiatry. This day, an occupation court has sentenced him for the 2 years in the settlement colony. A piercing chill of Soviet mock trials creeps from this sentence. The scales of crime and the violation committed by the occupation authorities in Crimea demonstrate that Russia, which is recognized and occupying power by United Nations General Assembly, clearly ignores its international legal commitments. In this context, allow me to express my gratitude for the particular attention that the Parliamentary Assembly and the Council of Europe itself paid to the issue of Crimea. Numerous appeals of the Council of Europe monitoring bodies on human rights to access Crimea are all telling. As telling in an unprecedented decision by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, the situation in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and in the city of Sevastopol, Ukraine, adopted this May. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me once again answer my question. Has something changed over the last 3 years since my last statement? Definitely yes. The international coalition in support of Ukraine and the rule of international law has only strengthened. And I am very grateful to the honorable members of this assembly for the solidarity in protecting Ukraine from the Russian aggression from the very beginning. The people of Ukraine will always remember the hand of support extended to us by our friends in the most difficult moment of our history. Exactly a year ago, this assembly adopted the resolution, Political Consequences of the Russian Aggression in Ukraine. And it states, I quote, that only significant and measurable progress toward the implementation can form the basis for the restoration of fully fledged, mutually respectful dialogue with the Assembly, end of quote. The Assembly then rightly reserved the right to annul credential of the Russian delegation if Russia continues the occupation of sovereign territories of Ukraine. In fact, none of the demands were implemented by Russia. It is not just about the implementation of the routine documents. Behind the provision of this document are human fates and human lives. Hence, there are reasons to return to business as usual with Russia in the Assembly and anywhere else within other international political platforms. In this challenging moment, let us be frank with each other and with ourselves. The aim of the Russian aggression is to destroy democracy, liberal freedom, and human rights. In one place, they do this with tanks. In other place, they do it with the absolutely fake news. In the one case, they violate key principle of the international law. In another case, they manipulate with their consciousness. And we have no rights to fail against this challenge. We will prove our dignity. And over the recent years, the members of the Council of Europe have experienced the delicacy of the Russian information warfare. Not once we have seen as a language of hatred, violence, and discrimination was hidden under the slogans of the free speech. Russia tries to use our own achievement against the democratic community. In 1950, Winston Churchill, an ideological father of the Council of Europe, appealed to this assembly against the background of the challenge of the democratic Europe from Soviet Union. And he admitted that Moscow had a wealth of opportunities for creating the trouble. Given the circumstances, he said something very important about the prospect of this assembly. I quote, "Either we shall prove our worth and weight and values of Europe, or we shall fall." With those words of wisdom in mind, I strongly reject some saying about fait accompli regarding Crimea. This tribune was not invented to call for the appeasement. Neither was it for the appeal of trade in territory, for money, oil, or gas. This has never happened. And I was invented to safeguard our fundamentals, our values, and our principles, and most importantly, to defend them in time of a need. The time has come, and it's now that Moscow pushed Europe back to the same reality as Sir Winston Churchill was so concerned by almost 70 years ago. That is why the guarantee of our success resides in preserving and strengthening of our unity, of our solidarity, and of our resilience. And it is only upon the respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine that we can achieve peace and stability in Europe. Ukraine strives for peace, as I believe everyone does in this hall. And as a head of state, I want a peace for Ukraine and for Europe. And these are not mere words. On a numerous occasions, Ukraine proved its readiness for peaceful settlement of the situation that was artificially created by Russia. And only in 2017, Ukraine and me personally as a president initiated long-lasting ceasefire 3 times. Easter ceasefire, harvest ceasefire, and back-to-school ceasefire. Russian occupational troops and their proxies violated them all almost right away. Last week, the Ukrainian parliament adopted the law establishing the condition for peaceful settlement of the situation in a certain area of the Donetsk in Lugansk region. We count that Russia will finally begin to implement the security commitment and the Minsk agreement. And we also expect that these steps will allow moving forward with the matter of the deployment of the United Nations peacekeeping operation in Donbass, as a very important instrument to bring peace back to my country. And I call the Honorable Assembly to continue to pay attention to the issue of respect human rights in the occupied Crimea and occupied Donbass. It is only upon our close attention to these regions that one could somehow ease today's prosecution in there. Thus, I call on the members of this Assembly, the Cabinet, the Committee of Ministers, the Secretary General, the Commissioner for Human Rights, other relevant monitoring bodies to double their efforts aimed at protecting human rights and freedom. Dear ladies and gentlemen, allow me again come back to my question yet again. Has something changed for over 3 years since my last statement? Again, definitely yes. Ukraine has a considerable progress along the way of internal transformation. Despite of the existential changes by Russian aggression, we this year celebrate the 20th anniversary of the entry into force Ukraine of the Convention of the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. Ukraine continues to implement its commitment as a member state of the Council of Europe while approximating its legislation, institution, and practice to the Council of Europe standards relating to the human rights, rule of law, and democracy. Last week, we have laid yet another firm brick in our human rights defense while having ratified Protocol 15 and Protocol 16 to this convention. And I would like also to express my practical gratitude to the Council of Europe, including this Assembly, that actively support the reform process in Ukraine. The scope of reform currently undertaken in Ukraine is quite broad. It ranges from the unprecedented financial and banking reform. We absolutely clarify our financial and banking system, make it very strong, very reliable, and up to the decentralization reform, which Madam President mentioned. And that was from the very first steps, me as a president, and now decentralization reform is bringing the first results. The budget of the local communities, the development budget is increased from 7 to 10 times during the war. And the local budget and the structure of the united budget is step by step reaching the 50%. Looking back of the accomplishment of Ukraine, I am practically pleased that the year 2015-2017 action plan of the Council of Europe for Ukraine has become our common story of success. I am proud that Council of Europe is co-sponsor of Ukrainian reform, and the progress reached in joint results of Ukraine and Council of Europe. And we hope that the new action plan for the year 2018-2021, which is currently drafted in the Council of Europe, will be even more ambitious and successful. And we consider the one as a tool for further progress in reform. For us, a front of internal transformation is no less important than the Russian front. Here I cannot but mention the anti-corruption measures undertaken by my country. We have established unprecedented anti-corruption infrastructure, anti-corruption mechanism, absolutely independent, creating the absolutely important National Anti-Corruption Bureau, specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecution Office, and the National Agency for Prevention of Corruption, independent. And under their investigation, there are ministers, members of parliament, local governors, and long list of public service. This system has already brings positive results. More often, we hear about loud criminal cases. However, the fight against corruption is not about the criminal prosecution alone. More important is the establishment of the effective system to prevent this disease which eroded Ukraine for years since independence. The launch of the electronic declaration of public servants' income, expenses, and financial obligation become one of the most effective tools in the fight against corruption, which exists in no other countries, but it brings the efficiency. It's perhaps one of the most ambitious initiatives of the government in the world from the standpoint and the transparency and accountability before society and voters. Particular attention we pay to the deregulation and minimalization of the public service influence, including by the means of the new technologies. The introduction of the ProZorro electronic platform, which is a totally new and absolutely transparent public procurement system, has become a brilliant story of success. The communication strategy in the field of preventing and countering corruption has also been adopted. It provides for routine and anti-corruption culture in the society. And one could reasonably ask if the anti-corruption glass is half empty or half full. My answer is the following. The one is exactly half full. The next strategic priority is further building up the judiciary and renewal social trust in Ukraine. And I'm sincerely grateful to the Council of Europe for the constant support this most important reform, which we jointly started back in the year 2014. The amendment of the Constitution on judiciary have been adopted with the expert assistance and support, very valuable support, of the Venice Commission in the year 2016. And we implement all the recommendation of every single word of the recommendation of the Venice Commission. Also, the new laws on judicial system and status of judges, on High Council of Justice, on Constitutional Court, new procedural codes were adopted just a few days ago. And in the next days, they would become to the presidential office for signature. And all this in less than 3 years. As the Venice Commission has pointed out in its recent opinion, this reform is clearly aimed at reconstructing Ukrainian justice system in accordance with the standards of Council of Europe and securing the rule of law in Ukraine. It was a tectonic shift that permitted to fill judicial system with a new substance and provide opportunity to build up a truly independent judicial branch of power based on the European standard. The complete reshuffle of judiciary system is underway. It started with the unprecedented relaunch of Supreme Court upon my initiative. Today, this highest judiciary institution in Ukraine is being set up from the scratch via open competition with active participation of the civil society. Among the winners of the competition to the post of judges of the new Supreme Court of Ukraine are lawyers, legal scholars, human rights advocates who have never worked as judges before, as well as the best judges from all over Ukraine. They have passed strict and thorough selection, including the professional and psychological tests, as well as the checks by the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and National Agency for Preventing Corruption. Of course, they still have to prove their capabilities in practice, but it should be the best composition of the Supreme Court in Ukraine's modern history. The High Council of Justice decided to submit 111 candidates be appointed as new judges of Supreme Court of Ukraine. And I will fulfill its absolutely due manner. The launch of the new Supreme Court and the entire judicial system, according to the new rules, become the point of no return for the judicial reform and those successful steps we undertook within its framework. And I know that the creation of the anti-corruption courts draws a special attention. The creation of anti-corruption court is envisaged by law on judiciary and status of judges, which I submitted to the Parliament, and it was adopted last year. The Venice Commission welcomed this initiative, mentioning the need for the cleaning and independent and absolutely efficient, especially anti-corruption judicial body. Currently, we are looking for the optimal way to establish this vital institution. Obviously, we should not lose the substance of the reform behind the name. Thus, efforts invested to the establishment of the Anti-Corruption Court would be successful if 4 elements are taken into account. First, legislation which complies with the Ukrainian constitution. Second, independent, politically neutral, and unbiased members of the commission that would select the judges. Third, candidates meeting highest professional and integrity standards. And fourth, newly created court should enjoy full trust of the society. Today, there are some questions regarding quality of the draft law pending in the Verkhovna Rada, in particular the draft law of the establishment anti-corruption court submitted by a number of members of parliament. And the provisions suggested by the members of parliament restoring significant influence on the formation of the anti-corruption court by such political bodies like Verkhovna Rada, government and Minister of Justice, and the President, particularly give rise to the concern, because all the judicial reform which is initiated by me was making an independent court system, completely independent also from the politicians. The recent Venice Commission expert opinion clearly pointed out that political influence on the formation of the anti-corruption court is absolutely unacceptable. It contradicts to the European standards and the concept of the constitutional reform, which should be built on the principle of maximum depolitization of judiciary. That is why there is a need for all democratic political forces and civil society to get united and work together with the engagement of the international experts in order to prepare a professionally new consolidated draft law and to pass it through the parliament. The main task before Ukraine is not only to establish the anti-corruption court, but also to ensure a fair legal proceeding within the framework of the unified and renewed system of justice. And today, the entire judiciary system in Ukraine has to be of the anti-corruption nature. This is an absolute prerequisite for the restoration of social trust and strengthening of the social unity. And we count on further support of you, of this Assembly, as regard of the strengthening of civil society in Ukraine based upon the implementation of the democratic standards, support of the cultural diversity, and the build-up the social institution. And in this regard, I would like to draw your attention to the unreasonable politicization of the law of education. My stance of education is clear. The quality of education determines the nation's future and security. Therefore, this area should be reformed. Apart from being a significant part of the educational reform, the adopted law has become a law of equal opportunities for each stakeholder in educational system. And let me be specifically clear. The equal opportunities for all pupils, equal for all, regardless of their origin, residence, or nationality. It is unacceptable that the children belonging to the national minorities in Ukraine do not have adequate knowledge of Ukrainian language, which is needed for further education in universities, institutes, absolutely necessary for the professional career, for the public service, and self-realization in Ukraine. And this law is to fix this problem. The Parliament of Ukraine has envisaged an improvement of learning Ukrainian at the level of preschool and primary education with a view of creating a condition for studying in an official language of on the higher level. At the same time, the law safeguards the rights to learn native language at the required level. Safeguard. And let me remind you that the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages, which was adopted here in Strasbourg 25 years ago, stipulated all commitments related to the national minority should be implemented without prejudice to the teaching of the official language or languages of the state. And I believe that the provision of this charter should be applied by all the signatories. And let me absolutely reassure you that with the guarantee language right in accordance with the national legislation and international commitments and standards, including the right to study in native language. At the same time, we will provide adequate learning of the official language, which is Ukrainian. And the best proof of this commitment is our decision to submit the respective article for assessment. That was my instruction to Minister of Education and to Minister of Foreign Affairs to send it to the independent assessment to the Venice Commission. And I believe that its conclusion will lift all the controversial interpretation of the law, which is aimed, and in fact, to ensure a decent place for all the national minorities in the integral Ukrainian society. And I am absolutely confident that we implement this recommendation of the Venice Commission or assessment Venice Commission in our new legislation about education. Dear ladies and gentlemen, there is hardly more evident example of a nation than Ukraine, which has to fight of two-front war at the same time. On the front of the countering external military aggression, restoration of sovereignty and territorial integrity, and on the front of the implementing difficult and complex reform. They say that it is impossible to provide and implement reform in the time of war. Ukraine now is an example that this is not only possible, we do it in an absolutely responsible way. And the turning point was the Revolution of Dignity, late 2013, early 2014. And it is very symbolic that on the margins of my visit to Strasbourg, I will inaugurate the Star of Heavenly 100 at the Strasbourg Alley of Stars. And it will be a star for those heroes of the Revolution of Dignity who sacrificed their lives for our right to build the new country by the European model. And for those heroes who took the European future of Ukraine as their reason of life, as their motivation and struggle against former regime and aspiration for changes and transformation in our country. And by opening the star for the Heavenly 100, we will commemorate their contribution to the history of Ukraine and to the history of Europe. And it is our common duty regarding their memory and sacrifice to win both fronts in Ukraine and strengthen the common values in Europe, in peaceful, stable, and prosperous Europe. And I believe that it will come true thanks to our unity and our solidarity. And I want to thank you for this unity. I want to thank you for this solidarity. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your support and confidence in our country. Glory to Ukraine and glory to Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, for your most interesting address. Members of the Assembly have questions now that they would like to put to you. I must remind them that all questions must be limited to 30 seconds and no more. Colleagues need to be asking questions and not making speeches. I will allow one question from each of the political groups first, and I will immediately call on Mr. Korodi from EPP to pose their question. Mr. Korodi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We had sufficient information on Crimea, so this is now I follow the second question. We follow closely the latest development in your country generated by the recent law on education, which drastically limit the right to education in the mother tongue of national minorities. As a Council of Europe member, say you should abide by the commitments assumed upon your accession, including in terms of protection of rights of national minorities. Why did you promulgate this law, despite the criticism expressed by your neighborhood countries and also by international European institutions and NGOs having significant ethnic communities in your territory? Thank you.
Thank you. And now I call... Sorry? Yes,
Thank you very much indeed for this question. Start with the law on education. First of all, our education system vitally needs reforms. And this is the investment in our future. And Ukrainian school has a great achievement. And we want to we want to modernize it to the current standard of the current world. The Article 7 of the law, criticized by some of our European partners, intends to improve the use of Ukrainian language in all spheres of public life, as well as the guarantee and free development of use of national minority. But could you imagine that the pupils which finishing the British, German, French school cannot speak English, French, and German? How they can survive in the country? Can you imagine that 75% of the graduates which finished the school in Beregovo failed the test on Ukrainian language? They simply do not understand the language. How they can go and survive in the country, go to work, go to the public services, how they can work or how they can continue the institution in Ukraine. This is a discrimination of these children. Definitely yes. And with that situation, we not having one single word against national minority languages. We would be happy if they learned it. We create this opportunity. We already do that. The only way we ask them is, please, you should learn Ukrainian. This is the protection of rights of these children. This is protection from the discrimination. And that's why we are, again, absolutely open. We sent the draft law for the assessment in Venice Commission. And again, we are ready for dialogue. We are ready to implement the results of this assessment. in our law, practical law about the education, secondary education. We especially do not develop and vote law on secondary education, waiting the results of the assessment. And this is our readiness for the cooperation. And okay, at the end of the day, let me give you my own examples. I was born in Belgrade, on the south of Odessa region, the center of Bulgarian minority in Ukraine. And I разбирам по-белгарски. Then I moved to the city when Romanian minority live. And mi înțelegi limba român. And then, when I work in Kiev with our Polish colleague, розумiem wszystko po polski. And I fluently speaks English. Я абсолютно спокійно і комфортно говорю по-русски. І, звичайно, що моєю мовою є українська мова. And this creates absolutely unique opportunity, and that's what I want to see among our national minority regions. To be bilingual, trilingual, the same way like in any other country. Is anybody against that? And the final figures. We have in Article 7 the guarantee for the children which learn European languages. Not only English and French, but also Hungarian, Polish, Bulgarian, Romanian, and others. And at the end of the education, from the 5th year of study, 60% would be, up to 60% would be national minority language, 40% would be Ukrainian. 60 to 40. And in the 12 years of study, it would be different proportion. 40% would be national language, national minority language, and 60% would be official language. Can you imagine? 40%. Not only national minority language, but some discipline would present it in national minority language. This is the law which we are talking about. And I think we should depoliticize discussion, have an absolutely clear and friendly cooperation, be open for this cooperation. I ask a member of my government, Minister of Education, come here in Strasbourg. They have a very long discussion. And if it would be necessary, Minister Grinevich would be happy to meet with you and to listen you and to implement every single step which is worrying you. So we are open. We are European. We meet all the criteria of all the convention. We together can solve any problem, including this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. And now immediately give the floor to Ms. Barnett from the Socialist Group.
Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident Porosenko, für Ihre interessanten Ausführungen. Dennoch, welche innenpolitische Schwierigkeiten gibt es denn immer noch, beziehungsweise sehen Sie sich ausgesetzt bei der Umsetzung der Minsker Vereinbarungen, gerade auch in Bezug auf den Donbass, die den Weg zur politischen Lösung versperren? Was wollen, was können, was werden Sie dagegen unternehmen? Wie gehen Sie damit um?
Thank you very much indeed for this question. This is extremely important for better understanding the current situation. In February 2015, in September 2014, we signed up Minsk Agreement, which has two parts, security package and political package. From the political package, Ukraine voted the amnesty law. From the political package, Ukraine voted the special order for some region of Donetsk and Lugansk. We vote in the parliament the line of territory which defined what is the occupied territory. We should implement this law. And we vote the first reading of the constitution. We implement 95% of the political package. What we're waiting from Russian side? Security package. First and most important, ceasefire. We don't have one single day without the fire. And we pay the highest price for that. More than 2,700 Ukrainian soldiers were killed. And more than 7,000 civilians were killed in this war. And we demanding ceasefire, point number one. Point number two, withdraw of all the foreign troops, including the Russian troops, from the occupied territory. This is their obligation under Minsk. Can you imagine any political process when we have an occupational troops on Donbass? Can you imagine anybody, the election which meet the criteria of ODIHR or OSCE or any democratic standards under the occupation of Russian army and Russian proxies? With the 45,000 people with their arms in the hands, they provide the free and fair election. With the situation that nobody has an opportunity to provide the campaign, with the no participation of Ukrainian political party, with the no participation of Ukrainian media, no participation of Ukrainian election commission, no participation with anything. It would be the same like referendum in Crimea, like fake referendum, and like fake election in year 2014. That's why we demand, please, implementation of security package, uninterrupted access of the special monitoring mission of OSCE observers to all occupied territory, including the border, releasing all the hostages. Everything now in hands of one person, Putin. And that's why it is vitally important, our solidarity and our unity. And as a demonstration of our decisiveness, me as the President of Ukraine, last week, introduced to the Parliament two very important laws. One about reunification of the country, and second, the continuation, the special order law, because we think that when we vote in year 2014, year 2017, everything finished. This territory would be reintegrated in Ukraine back. Nothing happened. And we continue for another year. And I thank to all my members of Parliament who vote for that, supporting my proposal. That is a very bright demonstration. Ukraine is united. Ukraine is capable to implement all the obligations. The only thing we need, unity and solidarity of the world. And the only thing we need is responsible behavior of Russia. Now, from when I was in New York, we agreed about the very important initiative of the peacekeepers, Blue Helmet of United Nations, under the mandate of the United Nations Security Council. Why anybody can be against that? Because that secured this territory. Because immediately, very next moment, every Russian soldiers which would be on this territory would be very brightly presented to the whole world community. But we need to insist on that. We need peace on my country. We need to stop killing Ukrainians. We need to restore law and order. And this is a vitally important question for me. And once again, I want to thank you, and all the Assembly, for the very strong support you demonstrate during the last year. This is vital for us, and thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I give the floor to Ms. Gillen from the European Conservatives. Madam.
President, on behalf of the European Conservatives, can I congratulate you on an astute and forthright speech to our Assembly today. Without a solution to the illegal actions of Russia in Crimea, their actions are going to poison European relations for years to come. How would you view, under the highest international scrutiny of PACE, the OSCE and the EU, the possibility of another referendum in Crimea with three choices: to stay with the Ukraine, to stay with Russia, or to be semi-independent under the UN supervision? Could you accept such a referendum, and could you abide by the will of the people?
First of all, thank you very much indeed for the very encouraging words. And I'm ready to expect anything which would be adequate to Ukrainian constitution. We have in our constitution referendum local and national. The territorial integrity and sovereignty, this is the competence of the national referendum. But before we talk about anything, Crimea should return back on Ukrainian sovereignty. Then we are ready for any negotiation and launching any democratic process under Ukrainian constitution. If Crimea would be under illegal annexation of Russian Federation, which happening in spring year 2014 and confirmed by all the international documents, this is impossible because this is under occupation. Can you imagine the referendum in the Czech Sudet in the year 1938? This is the same. Impossible to make a referendum under the barrels of the Russian tanks. This is not a referendum. And this has nothing to do with democracy. Crimea should be returned back to Ukraine. By the way, again, we are not selling or buying Crimea. This is not a question of money, gas, oil, or anything else. This is the law and order in Europe. This is the security in Europe and in the whole world. Because after illegal annexation of the Crimea, Russia completely destroyed the whole post-war security system based on the UN Security Council, where Russia was one of the P5 members. And another one, Russia, together with UK, together with US, together with France, with China, was a guarantee of our sovereignty and territorial integrity and the Budapest Memorandum, when Ukraine voluntarily gave up the third biggest nuclear arsenal in the world. Do you think if we will have nuclear weapons, does Russia attack us? I doubt. But this is not a question that we demand back the nuclear weapons, no. We, on contrary, think that non-proliferation system, this is the way to the global security. But that's why another reason why we need unity and solidarity with the whole civilized world. And I thank you and thank Britain for the strong support of our sovereignty. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Madame Brasser from the ALDE Group.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. President, I'm here. Welcome back to the Council of Europe, where I had the honor and the pleasure to receive you 3 years ago. In your remarkable speech, you referred of combating corruption, which is one of the greatest challenges, among others, you have to fight. The Venice Commission, and you referred to it in his, said that the provision has to be withdrawn and that you have to introduce now a new text in order to create an anti-corruption body. And you said you are going to do it. Do you have the majority in the Verkhovna Rada to give right to that request? And do you have the right people to implement afterwards that important law? Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank you for the very warm welcome you personally and Assembly give to me and to my country and to my people 3 years ago. I remember that, and thank you for your hospitality and for your very strong and firm position on that. I definitely think that we have a majority for the anti-corruption court as a symbol. Unfortunately, you know, in the parliament, devil is in details. And that's why I think this is extremely important that inside the parliament, all the members, we're not talking about the coalition. I want to have the votes of the whole parliament, because corruption is a cancer in any countries. And they should find out the compromise, present it to me, and I would be ready immediately initiate this draft law. We should work hard. But again, we do a great job during the last 3 years. We create such an anti-corruption institution which never exists in the known world. Somebody said that it is extremely important. For example, again, electronic declaration. All the members of parliament, all the ministers, all the governors should mentioning how many lamps, candelabra, or pots in their houses they have. But this is the price to be the public servant, to be transparent. National Anti-Corruption Bureau, even today, they provide in the investigation, arresting the ministers, and have a full independence. Now, we should have concentration efforts to help Parliament to find out compromising version. And I think that, first of all, I strongly believe in my parliament. Strongly believe. Because they do a great job for all the reform. And I am absolutely confident that they find out an opportunity to vote and to implement the anti-corruption court. Because, again, I want to remind you that the first time in Ukrainian legislation, term anti-corruption court was in my draft law, which is voted and already come in force. That's why I'm absolutely optimistic in that. And another, I want to once again thank the Venice Commission, because they play an important, very important, absolutely important role in the judicial reform. Every draft law has an assessment of the Venice Commission, and which is very important, you should understand. We have a trust. We trust Council of Europe and Venice Commission. Council of Europe and Venice Commission trust us. And this is a unique form of cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, the last question from Mr. Cox from the UEL.
Mr. President, in 2014 you promised this assembly, you said to this assembly, the only way out of the crisis in Ukraine is via a peaceful dialogue. When we visited you the year later in 2015 in Kiev with the Presidential Committee, you recalled that idea, peaceful dialogue, no military solution possible. It's now October 2017 and still the peaceful dialogue with the citizens in the east of your country has to start. You put the blame on the Russian Federation and they bear a huge responsibility, but where is your responsibility to finally do what you promised, to start a peaceful dialogue with the citizens of your country to come to an end of this horrible crisis? I'm looking forward to your answer.
Thank you very much indeed. Look, since our meeting in 2014, Ukraine delivered the 2/3 of the occupied Donbass. And in every single town, in every single village, when we don't have Russian troops, believe me, we have a fantastic dialogue. We don't have one single tiny problem. We invest a huge amount of money to restore the infrastructure with the assistance of our partners. And I, every month, visit in Donbass, opening school, opening bridges, roads, kindergarten, and we have a fantastic dialogue there. Can you imagine any dialogue on the occupied territory? Under the only precondition for this dialogue is withdrawal of Russian troops. We don't have any tiny conflict. And I'm proud that if from the very beginning Russia want to present that as a civil war, now we have a full list of evidence of Russian presence, of Russian hybrid war, of Russian propaganda, of Russian provocation. And this is not just a few thousand people. This is several million people, which live now in a disastrous humanitarian condition, with the disastrous level of unemployment, with the absolutely disastrous condition for the elderly people, with the limited access of the children to the education, with the disastrous level of poverty. And people hate the idea to continue to live in this condition. That's why it is vitally important, our coordinated position with the implementation of Minsk, which has a security package. And immediately, I'm absolutely confident, immediately when we have a peacekeepers, the blue helmet, immediately when we have a security precondition, we do the same, what we do in Slavyansk, in Lysychansk, in Kramatorsk, in many, many other cities, including Mariupol, when we have in restoring law and order and have a fantastic dialogue with the local communities. There is no any tiny reason for the disturbance. That's why it's so important, our unity and our solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for your comprehensive address and for updating us on the advancement of the reforms in Ukraine. We particularly appreciate your country's efforts to reform the judiciary, to fight corruption, to guarantee highest ethical standards, as well as to promote decentralization. Your views on the ways of a peaceful settlement of the conflict in Donbass are also very important. For there to be peace, stability, and respect for human rights, violence and fighting must stop, and it is therefore very important to assure full implementation of the Minsk Agreement. On behalf of the Assembly, I thank you most warmly for your address, for the answers given to questions, and I wish you and Ukraine every success. Thank you.
Good to see you.